Om Ajnanatimirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Dhena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namah.
Tameva manasagrinan Babhuva Pramadottama Anantaram Vidarbhasya Rajasinghasya Veshmani Tameva manasagrinan Babhuva Pramadottama Anantaram Vidarbhasya Rajasinghasya Veshmani. Translation: King Puranjana gave up his body while remembering his wife, and consequently in his next life he became a very beautiful and well-situated woman. He took his next birth as the daughter of King Vidarbha in the very house of the king. Purport: Since King Puranjana thought of his wife at the time of death, he attained the body of a woman in his next life, in his next birth. This verifies the following verse in Bhagavad Gita 8.6. Yang yang vapi smaran bhavam tachatyante kalevaram tam tamivaiti kaunteya sadatat bhava pavita. Whatever state of being one remembers when he quits his body, that state he will attain without fail. When a living entity is accustomed to think of a particular subject matter or become absorbed in a certain type of thought, he will think of that subject at the time of death. At the time of death, one will think of the subject that has occupied his life while he was awake, lightly sleeping or dreaming, or while he was deeply sleeping. After falling from the association of the Supreme Lord, the living entity thus transmigrates from one bodily form to another according to nature's course, until he finally attains the human form. If he is absorbed in material thoughts and ignorant of spiritual life, and if he does not take shelter under the lotus feet of the Supreme Personality of Godhead Govinda, who solves all questions of birth and death, he will become a woman in the next life, especially if he thinks of his wife. As stated in Srimad Bhagavatam 3.31.1, Karmana daiva netrena, a living entity acts piously or impiously, and sometimes in both ways. All actions are taken into account, and the living entity is offered a new body by his superiors. Although King Puranjana was overly attached to his wife, he nonetheless performs many pious fruitive activities. Consequently, although he took the form of a woman, he was given a chance to be the daughter of a powerful king, as confirmed in Bhagavad Gita 6.41. Praptya punya kritam lokan ushitva shashvati sama shuchinam shrimatam gehe yoga prashto bijayate. The unsuccessful yogi, after many years of enjoyment on the planets of the pious living entities, is born into a family of righteous people or into a family of rich aristocracy. If a person falls from the path of bhakti yoga, God realization, due to attachment to fruitive activity, philosophical speculation, or mystic yoga, he is given a chance to take birth in a high and rich family. The higher authorities are appointed by the Supreme Personality of God to thus render justice to the living entity according to the living entity's desires. Although King Puranjana was overly absorbed in thoughts of his wife and thus became a woman, he took birth in the family of a king due to his previous pious activities. The conclusion is that all our activities are taken into consideration before we are awarded another body. Narada Muni therefore advised Vyasadeva that one should take to Krishna consciousness, devotional service, and abandon all ordinary occupational duties. This advice was also given by Lord Krishna himself. Although a devotee may fall from the path of spiritual consciousness, he will nonetheless attain a human body in the home of a devotee or a rich man. In this way, one can resume his devotional service. Tameva manasah krihnan babhuva paradotama anantaram vidarbhasya rajasinghasya veshmani tam eva manasa granan. This refers to the story. This is in the context of the story that is being told by Narada Muni to King Prachinabarhi. King Prachinabarhi is the father of the Prachetas. And he was one of the great Prajapatis, those who helped to populate the universe in the beginning. There were those who were appointed to populate the universe through mental creation and then through sexual intercourse. And Prachinabarhi had 10 sons, and they went off to perform austerities for 10,000 years. And we heard about them yesterday because they had met with Lord Shiva just before they had gone underwater to perform their austerities. And although we didn't hear about it yesterday, Lord Shiva, it was alluded to, gave them some mantras to remember, to recite and remember, and thus attain perfection. And when they performed their austerities of remembering these mantras and staying underwater for 10,000 years, and they came out, they attained the direct association of Lord Vishnu, who became very pleased with them because they cooperated for austerities to come to the highest position of life. And while the Prachetas were underwater meditating, Prachinabarhi, who was a great king, was home in his kingdom and performing huge sacrifices, karma kanda sacrifices, during which many animals were killed. And Narada Muni came and met with Prachinabarhi while Prachinabarhi's sons were meditating in order to uplift him and give him advice. There are many different ways to give people advice. Sometimes when we give direct advice, it's not very well taken because everyone in this world has a conception of their selves that may be different from reality. People may think that I'm doing everything just right, and when they get advice, it's a little annoying. So Narada Muni, being expert, gave instruction to King Prachinabarhi by telling him a story about another king named Puranjana. Actually, we'll see that the story was actually about Prachinabarhi. But you might sit someone down and say, I'm going to tell you about this person, the historical account. And you go on telling the story, and at the end, the person might realize, oh, this is about me. So many similarities here. So similarly, Prachinabarhi realized at the end of the story that Narada Muni was telling the story of Puranjana for the benefit of Prachinabarhi. So Puranjana, the story of Puranjana, starts off with a young man who's walking in a beautiful park, and there are sweet breezes and flowers blooming. There are scents in the air that make one feel that life is good. And while Puranjana, the young hero, because those who are young and have vigor consider themselves heroes, and Prabhupada mentions in a purport in regards to Puranjana that there are two kinds of heroes in this world. One is the hero who is able to utilize his or her senses in order to dominate matter. We see that there are famous enjoyers of the material world, and they become famous because of their expertise in dominating others or in being very expert at sense gratification. And then Prabhupada mentions another kind of hero, and that is the hero who is able to control his or her senses. this person becomes known as a Goswami, or the master of the senses. This kind of hero is rare in this world. Because of lack of spiritual knowledge, people think that the goal of life is to utilize one's senses as much as possible. Even if people are pious, they still think that. The way that I enjoy myself in this world in a pious way is very nice. And King Prachinabarhi was also very pious. Nonetheless, he was the first kind of hero, the hero who is enjoying his senses through karma kanda. So this Puranjana, who Narada Muni conjured to give instruction to Prachinabarhi, as he's walking through the park, meets a beautiful young woman. And when he meets her, he becomes enamored of her bodily features. And he then begins a conversation with her. And this is an important aspect of the story because there's a way in which we're taught throughout the Srimad Bhagavatam that the prime cause of bondage in the material world is because of our mistaken identity with our body. We think, I am my body. And a man thinks I'm a man, and a woman thinks I'm a woman. A cat thinks I'm a cat, and a mongoose thinks I'm a mongoose. But actually, we're none of these things. We are wholly distinct from the body, the bodily form. But because of the false ego, I identify myself with the external body. And on the basis of the bodily conception of life, a male becomes attracted to a female, and a female becomes attracted to a male. This takes place under the influence of the three modes of material nature, and is the prime cause of entanglement in the material world. In fact, as Prabhupada pointed out many times, if that impetus and attraction between male and female wasn't present in the material world, then people wouldn't work very hard. There would be no big buildings and enterprise. There'd be people, there'd be no people driving up and down the freeway at breakneck speeds. Because the main impetus in life begins with this idea of male and female. As Rishabhadeva mentions later in the Srimad Bhagavatam, later than the 4th canto, in the 5th canto, Pumsa striya maitini bhavametam tayom ritu hridayam grantamahu ato griya kshetra sutakta vitera janasya moho yamaham mameti. He gives a sutra for the way in which one becomes attached to the material world and then thinks in terms of I and mine. And we discussed this earlier, that a living entity who's actually an eternal servant of Krishna, has nothing to do with this world, falls into the illusion that I have some stake in this world, and I have my things, my family. So he says, Pumsa striya maitini bhavamitam. There's an attraction between male and female. And this attraction comes from the spiritual world. Because, as Prabhupada explains in the 1st canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam, there's the Adi Ras. There's Radha and Krishna, who have their eternal loving affairs in the spiritual world. But with that same energy comes to the material world. It gets mixed up with the lower modes of material nature, and it becomes a perverted reflection of the original Adi Ras. It's called Hlada Tapakari, and that means that in the spiritual world, what is most enjoyable, there is no higher enjoyment than the rasa, than participating and serving the rasa between Radha and Krishna in the spiritual world. But when that same energy is transported into the modes of material nature, it becomes the cause of suffering and bondage for the living entity who's part of the internal potency. And this is the way in which the living entity becomes captured by the material energy and then suffers. So when male and female, called Pumsa Striya, Pumsa means the enjoyer, and striya means one who expands the material field for enjoyment. Pumsa striya, in the forms made by material nature, when the male and female come together, then they unite sexually. Pumsa striya maitini bhavamitam. And when there's contact through sexual unification, then there's a hard knot within the heart. This is called Hridaya Granthi. The knot becomes tied very tightly within the heart, and it's very difficult for the man and woman not to be enamored of one another. In fact, even if they grow to dislike one another, they're still enamored, and they're still attached to one another in this bond which is tied with a tight knot. Hridaya Grantha Mahu. And because of that, we have Home Depot, and we have Costco, and all the other industries of the world, because the verse then goes on to say, Aho Kriyakshetra Sutaptavitar, which means that because of this feeling that I have my own clan, and I'm attached to a particular woman, I'm attached to a particular man, we have our offspring. My friend Ruchi, the late great Ruchi, book distributor, when he was distributing, talking to a family, he said, showing the book, said, "Are these your offspring?" Then we require a field, some facility in order to support our clan. Ato Griya Kshetra, you have to have a place where you can work. Everyone has to have some kind of job, and you have to have a place where you can live. We visited a lot of the places here in Toronto recently, and they're not so nice. I mean, there are only a handful of people that live in spacious, handful of people in the whole world that live in nice, spacious areas, and even those are contaminated by the lower modes of material nature. Most people that we met the other day live in horrible little cooped up apartments, and they're dirty, they smell bad, and so forth. In any case, that's Kali Yuga, the Kshetra, the field, and then you have to have a field of activities, means you got to grow stuff, or you got to work hard for somebody else who's growing stuff, so that you can support this idea of my Kshetra and my loved ones. Atogriya Kshetra Sutatavid. Janasya moho yamahamamedi. And in this way, there's a progression through which I become entangled in the material world, and I think in terms of I and mine. I think of all my things and my family members as very dear to me and as mine, and I go on in this kind of illusion. So Puranjana starts off by becoming attracted to a young woman and proposing to her. And she readily accepts his proposal because she considers him a great hero, thinking that he will give me happiness, support me, and will live happily ever after. And as the story continues, we find that Puranjana goes through the course of his life, and it follows a natural progression that one might go through. During youth, one might feel very optimistic about one's chances to enjoy and go on blindly enjoying material nature, man and woman together. But as he gets older, he finds that his power to enjoy diminishes. And then finally, and I'm cutting out thousands of details, which one can read for oneself, he comes to the time when death is approaching. And he begins to lose his powers, sensory powers. And his body, which is described throughout the analogy, throughout the story that Narada is telling, his body is analogous to a city. And the city gets attacked by the agents of death who come to take him away. So at the time of death, Puranjana, because he had throughout his life not cultivated spiritual knowledge and had been completely attached to his wife, thought of her at the time of death. So Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, young, whatever vapi smaran bhavam, whatever feeling you have, whatever subject matter attracts you the most when you leave your body, that you will be accommodated for by material nature, which is extremely precise in accommodating the soul. And Krishna talks about this in the Bhagavad Gita. He tells how we're moving from one body to the next. Shariram yaravapnoti yatshap yukramatishvara grihitvaitani samyati vayur gandam ivashaya. He says the soul, who he calls in this verse that I just quoted, Ishvara. We're not actually Ishvara, but because the soul becomes mixed up with matter and thinks that I'm the controller and tries to control matter, he actually becomes implicated. But Krishna sort of sarcastically calls him Ishvara in this verse. Shariram yaravapnoti yatchap yukramatishvara. He takes some bodies and he gives up other ones, and then he accepts new ones. And it has to do with a subtlety that's going on, and that is the subtle desires that the living entity develops within his mind. And the mind carries him to the next body. And he gets outfitted, custom fit body, just to meet whatever desires he has. Before I quote the verse that I'm referring to, I'll go back to the purport. And in the purport today, Srila Prabhupada mentions that there's a divine order in the universe, karmana daiva netrena. That is, we don't choose ourselves what we get in our next body. Karmana daiva netrena. Daiva means there's a superior authority who decides what we get according to who we are. And Prabhupada points out that we can understand to some degree where our dominant thoughts are going by observing how we daydream, what kind of dreams we have when we're sleeping. Because then the senses are on their own and mind is simply spinning. And then you can see, what do I dream about regularly? Do I dream about Krishna and Vrindavan? And or something else? Does my mind fly off in another direction? Because these kinds of states are more parallel to what one will experience at the time of death. At the time of death, we don't have control over our senses and will only be dependent on our predominant feeling. And whatever subject matter generally that attracts us in this lifetime, while we're conscious or while we're sleeping, in light sleep or deep sleep, will also attract us at the time of death. So Krishna then says, Shotram chakshu sparshanam cha, referring to the Bhagavad Gita 15th chapter. Shotram chakshu sparshanam cha rasanam grahanam eva cha. What he's naming here are the various senses, which are mostly, if you'll notice right now, they're grouped about the head. They're around this area on the robot. You get a special robot to drive around in. And the senses are grouped about the head. The central controlling feature, the software that keeps them all running properly, is the mind. So Shotram, the ear, Chakshu, the eyes, Rasanam, the tongue, Cha, and the other senses, Shotram, Chakshu, Sparshanam, Cha, the feeling of touch, Rasanam, the tongue, Granameva, Cha. That there's all these senses that we have in our body, and they're grouped about the mind, and they are very specifically given to us according to our previous desires from our last life. It's an award by material nature because, as Krishna had said in the previous verse, we're Ishvara, little I, Ishvara. It means that we get to control our destiny. And how do we do it? By the force of our own consciousness. Shotram chakshu sparshanam cha rasanam granam eva cha adhishtaya manaschayam vishayanupasevate. In this way, Krishna says that the living entity is situated in a particular body and it's dependent on the mind. And then he says, Ukramantam stitam vapi bhunjanam va gunanvitam vimudha nanupashyanti pashyanti jnana chakshusa. Says, so an intelligent person or a person who's trained in this knowledge that we're learning from the story of Puranjana, from Narada Muni, can see what's happening. He can see it in other people, and he can see it in him or herself, in being a resident of this body, and also when he or she leaves the body, that devotee can see what's taking place. Ukramantam, so krama means to step. So utkramantam means he's stepping out of the body. Stitam vapi bhunjanam va gunanvitam. A person who's not trained in this knowledge can't see what's happening. So Krishna goes on to say, yatanto yoginas chayanam pashyantyatman avastitam. A person who studied all this properly from the Bhagavad Gita and the Srimad Bhagavatam knows what's happening, but other people who are akritatmano, they're not trained in the science. They don't know what's happening. It's a big mystery to them. And they simply become caught up in the waves of material nature and swept away. And this is the norm in this material world. Everyone thinks, I'm my body. And to this end, in the 7th canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam, we get a story from Hiranyakashipu, who is appeasing his relatives just after the death of Hiranyaka. And he tells about a king named Suyagya. And Suyagya was a great hero on the battlefield. And in his last battle, where he was killed, he had fallen to the ground, his limbs broken. He was biting his lip to show his prowess as he died. His beautiful hair had been covered with dust. The jewels hanging from his neck and ears now covered with dirt and blood from the battlefield. And his many wives then came from the palace to the aftermath of the battle, and they gathered around the body of Suyagya, and they clutched his dead body, and they began to wail into the evening air. And as night approached, Yamaraj could understand by hearing that there were some very attached living entities who were holding on to the body of their dead husband in complete ignorance. So much so that the time for the cremation of the body was approaching, but they wouldn't let go. And Yamaraj then, to instruct them, assumed the form of a 5-year-old child. How old are you, Govinda? 4? So Yamaraj came as a child that was 1 year older than you. But you'll be 5 pretty soon, right? So he was around. To take a look at Govinda real quick. You see what he looks like? So Yamaraj came, he looked just like Govinda. And he came to the battlefield, and he asked them, why are you crying? And they said, our husband the king is dead. Dead and gone. And the little boy, Yamaraj, in the form of a little boy, said, I think you're mistaken, because actually he's right there. And they argued with him, and finally he revealed himself. He said, you don't know anything. Because he said, listen, there's the same eyes, the same nose, the same legs, arms, everything's there. How can you say he's gone? He said, actually, you never saw your husband. Throughout your whole life, you were attached to a conception of what you thought was your husband. It was conjured by material nature. However, he's left his body just as he entered it. He never even touched the material body. He's only passing through. Nonetheless, one becomes enamored of the particular situation one's in and thinks in terms of one's family, one's country, one's political party, one's team that one roots for, and thinks, these are mine, and this is related to my body. So, the mistaken living entity comes into this world and thinks that I'm a particular body. But actually, if you consider previous life, a woman may have been a man, just as in this story. We find that Puranjana, who thought of his wife at the time when he left his body, then took the body of a woman. And you'll see the precision through which he achieves this body, because he had performed many pious activities. He was given an exalted place in a very high family. Nonetheless, because he thought of the form of a woman, he was very attached, he became a woman. And those who were women in their last life, they may become a man. So oftentimes there's this idea of tension between men and women, but the foolish living entity doesn't know that the man was a woman in her last life. See, it gets confusing. And if we were actually able to see the various ways through which we're transmigrating from one body to another, we may be startled, just as was Chitraketu when he became so attached to his little son that when the son died and Narada and Angira brought the soul of the little child back into its baby body and said, "Why did you leave so soon? Here's your father." And the living entity looked up and he said, "Sorry, but I don't recognize you. I've had millions of fathers and mothers. So I accept if you say this is my father or mother, but I don't, it doesn't really mean that much to me." And when the soul is within the womb of the mother, Lord Kapiladev teaches us in the 3rd canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam, fortunate souls become aware that they're transmigrating and that they've come back into another womb. And they also realize that I'm helplessly being carried along by the strong current of material nature, just as one's carried away by a river and drowned. And that fortunate soul, in a moment of clarity, sees that what's going to happen is, as soon as I come out of the birth channel, my senses will externalize and become again captured by the objects of the senses. And I'll be surrounded by so-called relatives who then, first of all, slap a name tag on me. They make a little name and they slap it right on your chest. Say, "Here's your new name. Your new name is Shnicky." And we find later in the 11th canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam how the Hamsa avatar explains how this happens. That the living entity's senses that are awarded to him are part of the material nature, and therefore the senses and the sense objects are naturally embedded within one another. The senses are embedded within the sense objects, and the sense objects are embedded within the mind of the living entity. Therefore, it's no wonder that when we look out into the world, we're naturally attracted to certain sense objects, because they're intricately connected. And this tiny living entity, when he comes out in a little baby's body, then has his senses externalized. His senses become externalized, and they then naturally become attracted to their objects, and he becomes overwhelmed and he forgets. In the song that we sang this morning, it says, Bhajiba Bulia Eshe, Shangshara Bitare, Bulia Rohile Tumi, Abhijara Bhari. Lord Chaitanya is speaking through the pen of Bhaktivinoda Thakur and saying, you made a promise while you were in the womb. And this is what Kapiladev says. The living entity prays and says, I've forgotten you life after life, and this time I don't want to forget you. In fact, he knows he'll forget again. And therefore he says, let me stay in this horrible condition of the womb, because at least now I can remember who I am and what my real position in life is. And so Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is so kindly reminding the living entity and saying, you forgot. Remember, you promised. You're a soul. You want to be connected with Krishna in devotional service, but by the force of material nature, you've fallen into ignorance and you've forgotten. So he said, now remember, take to devotional service. So this knowledge is vital for survival in devotional service. One has to remember that I'm being victimized by the material nature. And I'm also victimizing others because of my false ego and the way I'm presenting myself as a man, woman, and many other different forms of life. In fact, when we read the entire section of the story of Puranjana, which is extremely edifying, that we were in Govardhan this last year. This year. And we read the whole third and fourth canto together in a little room. There was about 20 devotees in there. 15 of them were brahmacharis. And one of the brahmacharis afterwards, after he heard the entire passage of Puranjana told by Narada Muni, he talked to his spiritual master, Keshavarti Maharaj, and he just said, "What was I thinking?" And this is a question of living entity. What are you thinking? How did you get into this? And don't stay here. Come out of this illusion. And come to the sobriety of understanding that you're an eternal servant of Krishna. You have nothing to do with this material body. And you're not a man, you're not a woman, you're not a cat, you're not a dog. You're actually an eternal spiritual being. And only from this perspective can one be effective in this world. Otherwise, one simply becomes enamored of the illusion that is pervasive everywhere in the material world. Now we'll take some reflections or questions. Yes?
Thank you for Hare Krishna. That's not working.
I'll repeat until he turns it on.
Thank you for the gospel. I wanted to reflect on how you... Hare Krishna. I wanted to reflect on how you said about people living in the cities in smaller apartments which are ugly and stinky, etc. And as devotees, we learn about that it is not natural, it's actually disgusting, and we should be living in nicely close to nature places. And yet, devotees, very few devotees actually would go and live in the farm or outside of the city. Well, partially, maybe mostly because devotees are too used to the city life at that point. But another reason would be, as I'm thinking, devotees are willing to stay in the same environment as other people to do the outreach, to invite them to their homes, to show Krishna consciousness to them. Otherwise, the devotees would be getting this knowledge, leaving the city, there's no one else there.
Yes, exactly. There's great benefit to living in a natural environment because one can see in nature all of Krishna's lessons. They're right there in front of us. However, in the mood of Prahlad Maharaj, who says there are many yogis who go off to the Himalayas in order to cultivate spiritual life. But he said, I'm not one of those yogis. He said, I want to live in the big cities and towns. And I want to be there so I can go door to door. And Prabhupada mentions in his purport to the several verses in which Prahlad Maharaj is saying this to Lord Nrsingadev. Let me live in the city where the people are being victimized by the material nature the most, and let me spread Krishna consciousness. Prabhupada says this is the impetus of the devotees to live in the big cities and towns. And that is so that they can go door to door and teach people to chant Hare Krishna. And we appreciate that Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu has set up these apartments in little rows so it's really easy to get from one to the next. In fact, it's the vision of those who are spreading the Krishna consciousness movement to see all the opportunities that we have because of conglomerations of people. This is a way to live in a transcendental way in the material world, is to see everything as an opportunity to spread the Krishna consciousness movement. This is the way in which one can transform the material world into the spiritual world. Devotees are always looking to see how to use everything to spread Lord Chaitanya's movement. And then it becomes transformed from material to spiritual. What other reflections do you have or questions? Krishna's Kaviraj Prabhu.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for being here. You know how much I appreciate seeing you. I hope you know how much.
I don't.
No, actually you do.
It's interesting that I was involved in a public, a Ahmadiyya Muslim ecumenical talk recently. And I just got the realization today, I mean, I've sort of meditated on it before, but it seemed to really coalesce today when you were talking about how the living entity really has nothing to do with the body. And I mean, I've heard it so many times, but it really seemed to come out that every other religion, basically, they think that they began at their birth. And I often say, but don't you believe your spirit? And spirit has no beginning and no end. No, I began, 20 years ago or 40 years ago or whatever. They all think like that. And they don't get that, this idea that you are completely different from the body and you're the spirit soul. So they're, even within their religion, they are caught up in this idea that they are this body. And because it's their religion, they really don't want to let go of that idea. Which is very unfortunate, because the whole crux of religion is understanding that you're not this body. And it just, I don't know, that whole realization just really came together for me today.
It's a really good point you make. And therefore, at the beginning of the Bhagavatam, Srila Vyasa says, Dharma prochita kaitavotra paramo nimatsaranam saram. That the gloves are off now. We're not messing around. This is straightforward explaining what self-realization is. Bhagavatam doesn't hold anything back. If you read the whole Bhagavatam, you'll become self-realized. And really, there's not much of a chance if you don't. You have to read the whole Bhagavatam, and you should actually read it repeatedly, at least 5 to 10 times. That would be minimum, in order to be oriented properly in this material world without becoming overwhelmed by the external feature. And this point you make about doubling down into the bodily conception of life by making it one's religious belief that I am my body is a product of ignorance. And it's a kind of cheating. And Narada Muni and all the great sages are really against it, just as you are. And that's why we distribute the Bhagavatam, because it's a revolution against this kind of ignorance, to wipe out illusion once and for all. And it's not so easy because it creeps in constantly. You have to be forever vigilant to not become victimized by the material energy, because it happens so easily. Even for highly learned people, even highly advanced people are no match for the material energy. So one always has to keep oneself in a humble state of mind and feel oneself subservient to one's guru and to the Srimad Bhagavatam. And one has to hear the Bhagavatam constantly in order to maintain this conception, because it's very easy to drift away from it. Thank you. Really nice point. What else you all have? What did you hear and what did you think of? Kamalakanta Acharya.
I have a clarification to ask and a question after that.
Oh, good.
You're mentioning one gets the body depending upon his karma. Is that right?
Yes.
So my question is, what about the devotees who have been practicing for so many years, and even after practicing, and in the end they think of Krishna, but still due to their past lives, karmas, would they still go back to Krishna, or they still have to deal with the karma and get some kind of body?
Well, we can learn from the story of Bharat Maharaj, who was a king and in the prime of his life, but he left and he went to the forest And he had attained a very high state of spiritual realization, so much so that tears were coming from his eyes, and he was his heart had softened. He was in the beginning stages of bhava. And then he whimsically got attached to a deer. And because of that, he had to take 2 more births. And so this section of the Bhagavatam shows us how a devotee who's practicing devotional service, who deliberately falls down from the practice of devotional service, may have to go through some other situations in the material world. However, because that devotee has made an advancement, Krishna gives him the realization of what happened so that he can continue where he left off with even greater vigor, just as Bharat Maharaj did. When he took birth as a deer, he realized it. That was Krishna's arrangement. He came out as a little deer in a deer family, and he told his deer family, I gotta go. I'm actually a yogi. And he took off again back to the ashram that he had been practicing previously, and he stayed there with the sages. Little deer took 3 baths a day. He was doing Ashtanga yoga. And in his next life, he became Jad Bharat, one of my all-time heroes of the Bhagavatam. He comes out into the world with full realization of the danger of material nature, and then becomes deaf and dumb to the world so that no one will try to interact with him. And he's in the topmost position of consciousness. However, he protects himself by not interacting with the world at all. And in this entire story, we find out how it is that Krishna protects his devotee and also gives an opportunity for the devotee to become purified. And this is always the case when devotees are practicing. In fact, somebody takes to devotional service, Krishna says in the 5th canto of the Bhagavad, Satyam Drishati Artitam Artito Nrinam Naivartito Yat Yam Artito Yata Swayam Vitate Bhajatam Anichatam Ichapitaram Nijapada Pallavam. In this verse, Krishna says that sometimes devotees take to the process of devotional service and then they start asking for material things. They get enamored of the material world and Krishna, give me this, give me that. And he says, I give it to them because I'm the bestower of all benediction, but I give it in such a way that they won't ask for it anymore. And that I cover over their desire for material enjoyment, and instead I give them my lotus feet. And in the Sri Upanishad, in the verse in which the devotees praying to the Lord, oh my Lord, let this temporary body be burnt to ashes, and let the air of life be burnt. Let air of life be merged with the totality of air. Now, my Lord, please remember all my sacrifices, and because you are the ultimate beneficiary, please remember all I have done for you. It's a beautiful verse. Vayur anilamamritam atedam bashvantam shariram. Om kratos smara kritam smara, kratos smara kritam smara. When I first read that verse, I got a Sri Upanishad from a bookstore called Shambhala Books in Berkeley, because I saw an advertisement for it in the Back to Godhead magazine. And when I read that verse 17, I said, this is for me. Because it was about how the body's being burned to ashes and the air gets merged with the totality. And it said, this is real spiritual knowledge. And in that purport, Prabhupada says that if a devotee who's dedicated his life to the Lord happens to forget at the time of death, then Krishna will make an arrangement for him to remember. There is no karma for one who surrenders to Krishna. We don't have a material body anymore when we enter into devotional service. This is explained in the Chaitanya Charitamrita when Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was speaking to Sanatan Goswami and Haridas Thakur. The Sanatan Goswami had these itching sores all over his body. And Chaitanya Mahaprabhu embraced him and the sores disappeared. But he had to suffer for some time. And there it's explained that the devotees, there Chaitanya Mahaprabhu explains that the devotees don't have a material body anymore. They have what's called sadhaka deha. It's a practitioner's body. It's different from a materialistic body. And although it may appear to go through all the other changes, because you're on the team, you've already joined, you're under Krishna's special protection. And those kinds of so-called karma that comes to a devotee are actually just burning off the last vestiges of his material desires. But all of these things are explained in the Shastra, like Yastvindra Gopa Matavendra Mahosa Karma Bandhanu Rupa Palabhajana Matanoti Karmani Nirdahati Kintucha Bhakti Bhajam Govinda Mari Purusham Tamaham Bhajami. This Brahma says that everyone's getting karma, from Indra down to the Indra Gopa germ, except for the devotees, because they're engaged in bhakti bhajan. Their karma is being nullified. And also, Rupa Goswami quotes aparada palam papam. What is it? Aparada palam papam bijam papam bijam palon mukam krame naiva pradiyante Vishnu bhakti ratatmanam. That everyone's got some kind of karma hanging from them. In fact, it's really complicated the way karma works, because some of it gets stored up and you can't use it all in one lifetime. So they keep it in one of those little extra storage places you see around here. And then, they hold it for you for a previous life, so you'll have to suffer and enjoy that karma. But Vishnu Bhakti Ratatmana means that somebody who's engaged in Vishnu Bhakti destroys all the different kinds of karma that are listed here. Aprarabdha, palam papam, bijam, palon mukam. There's different stages of karma. And some are manifest, some are very subtle, some haven't even come to existence, but they're all destroyed. And Jiva Goswami explains that they're destroyed, you say, simultaneously. There's some differences of opinion. Some say that the oldest karma is destroyed first and then the newer karma later. Some say the newer karma and then the older karma. But Jiva Goswami said it doesn't make any difference. It's all destroyed. And then he gives an example of a pile of 10,000 lotus petals being pierced by a needle. You push through it, yes, it started one end and went out the other, but actually, if you watch it, it's simultaneous. It just goes through. And so all your karma is destroyed by the process of devotional service. And what you're getting is Krishna's personal direction, helping his devotee move from one situation to the next to become purified. I used up a lot of air doing that last answer. Anything else? So, we've had a great weekend. We all went on the Sankirtan. That's a big victory, don't you think? And we also had a fundraiser last night, during which we raised about how much?
Over $55,000.
A cool $55,000.
Yeah.
In a period of half an hour. And that's all used for massive distribution of books. And I was talking to Gora last night after the yajna, and I was saying, or maybe it was this morning, for predominantly Grihastha communities, this is really important. You have to have a big yajna pit to throw in all your stuff. And this is the ideal yajna. You make a big pit, and then you throw in your money, like the devotees were doing last night. They come up and they throw in they throw their Lakshmi in the fire. And if you throw your Lakshmi here or there in the material world, it just entangles you more. You become more attached to it. But when you give it to Krishna, especially for the Sankirtan Yajna, to expand it, then you grow in Krishna consciousness. You're filled with knowledge, and you get detachment from the world naturally because of giving your money, which will be taken anyway by force. And so setting up these yajnas in which everyone can throw in all their money and then using it to print books and distribute them is the ideal yajna for this age of Kali Yuga. So we had a successful yajna. And any other things that we're grateful for from the last weekend?
The Sangha itself.
Just the Sangha. It's been really wonderful. Thanks everyone for joining us this morning here on a beautiful Monday here in Toronto. And and nice snowflakes are coming down. And thanks for everyone for joining us online from various places around the world. Gaur Premanande, Nitai Gaura Haribo, 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 Nitai Gaura Haribo, Bo, Haribo, Nitai Gaura Haribo.
Natari Armarman, Natari Armarman, Natari Armarman, hey, Natari Armarman, Natari Armarman, Natari Armarman, Natari Armarman.